But no matter what way you're joining us, it's great that you have made it. And we're just going to dive into kind of the last section in the book of Philippians. And Lorraine is going to finish off the book next week. So we're just going to look at today's section of Scripture, which will come on the screen, Philippians Chapter 4. I'm going to be looking from verses 10 through to verse 13. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Let's just pray, and then we'll unpack God's word. Gracious God, just come and make these moments a thin space. A space where we sense you reaching down through eternity to speak into our lives. So Holy Spirit, touch my lips, open our hearts, and transform our lives. Amen. I just want to talk for a few minutes about thank you notes. Maybe think about the times that you had to write a thank you note. Maybe you wrote them as a child, maybe after a birthday or after Christmas. Well, here's a thank you note that I found from a child on the internet. It says, "Dear Grandma and Grandpa, thanks for what you got me. Love, Dylan. P.S. I forgot what you got me." Or this other lovely thank you note that a teacher called Miss James got. "Thank you for always helping me. I am sad I am leaving. I will miss you. You are kind. My dad likes you and he doesn't even like Mum, so you must be nice." Really like that one. This one's my favorite. "Dear Mum, thank you so much for being my mum. If I had a different mum, I would punch her in the face and go find you. Love, Brooke." Now, I reckon Brooke might need some professional help, to be honest. But thank you notes on the whole are nice to receive. But what about writing them? Think of the times you've had to write a thank you note saying thank you for birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, or wedding gifts. "Dear Auntie Mabel and Uncle Brian, it was great to see you at the wedding. Thanks for the toaster. We use it every day. It looks great in our kitchen. Thanks, Pete and Claire." Pretty simple and straightforward, isn't it? Which is okay for a toaster. But what about those times when someone just goes way above and beyond? How do you say thank you to them? Imagine there's a couple and they've been trying to have a child, but they can't. So they decide to have some IVF, and yet for some reason they don't meet the NHS criteria. So they need to do this privately. And yet it costs so much money. But there's this older couple who's a part of their lives, an older couple who've been really kind to them, who've prayed for them, and who are watching them struggle as they try and work out this situation with IVF. And there's a day when this older couple sit down at their dining room table and they write a £10,000 cheque to help them with the IVF. How would you say thank you for that? "Dear Mabel and Brian, it was great to see you at dinner last night and thanks for the cheque. We hope to buy some strong swimmers with it. Fingers crossed. Thanks a bunch, Pete and Claire." I mean, how do you say thank you for that? I mean, it's not a toaster. How do you express your gratitude for something as potentially life-changing as that? "Dear Auntie Mabel, it was good to see you at the hospital. Thanks for the kidney. It looks awesome next to the other one." You know, when someone does something that's just over the top, served you in a phenomenal way, sometimes we struggle to say how grateful we are and what a life changer that was for us. And in this final section of Paul's letter to the Philippians, he's got to find a way to say thank you. This isn't like thank you for the toaster. This is a thank you for a 10-year investment that his friends living in Philippi have made in the Apostle Paul's life. Have a little look at the map that's on the screen. You can see Philippi, it's there in northern Greece. And at some time around 50 AD, Paul came to the city of Philippi with something called the gospel. And the gospel, it means good news. It's good news that a generous, loving creator stepped into a broken and messed up planet in the person of Jesus. And that while Jesus was here, Jesus generously gave his life up for us. And because of his resurrection, he is alive. And Paul's message is believe and follow. And that's the message of the gospel, the good news. And he was there in about 50 AD, but about 10 years later, roughly 60 AD, the Apostle Paul has been imprisoned, believed to be in Rome. And you can see Rome on the map as well. And the distance between the two is reckoned to be about 4,000 miles by road. Now, the Philippians have figured out where Paul is, which is some achievement when you consider the distances involved. There's no GPS tracker or anything like that. But somehow they've tracked the apostle down and they send a messenger by the name of Epaphroditus with some money for the apostle Paul. Now, my understanding is that the apostle was under house arrest, and that while under house arrest, the Roman government would give you some food, and it would be kind of moldy bread, just enough so you wouldn't die of starvation. You'd have some clothes, and again, just enough so you weren't naked, but never enough to keep you warm in the winter. And so if you wanted to eat well, if you wanted to be dressed adequately while in Roman imprisonment, you either needed a sizable bank account or you needed friends to swoop in from outside to take care of you. And so friends from Philippi discover where Paul is and swoop in. I want you to try and imagine Paul's response when there's a knock at the door and it's opened and there's Epaphroditus. It made me think, I wonder if he was so emotional after seeing a friendly face after all this time that maybe this hard-hearted apostle cried. I mean, it's 10 years since he was in Philippi. You know, I can imagine his jaw dropping and it's Epaphroditus, what are you doing here? And he, but I've brought you some money. I brought you something from your friends. And how do you say thank you for that? I mean, it's not like the toaster. It's a big deal. And that's what's going on in these last 10 verses in Philippians, where Paul is taking 10 verses to express his appreciation. And while he's doing that, some other topics just kind of pop up randomly. Number one has to do with the idea of contentment. Remember, it's a thank you note that Paul wants to say thank you to his friends. But he's wanting to make very clear to his friends what the money did do for him and what the money didn't do for him. Maybe we think Paul should have written something like, now I finally have this cash. I have great joy and now I have great peace. We might think that is what he should write, but he doesn't. He wants them to understand something else. He wants them to understand that he was already experiencing great joy, that he was already experiencing peace. He was experiencing these things before the gift of money came. And so he's writing this thank you note and he's saying, listen, I just need you to know something. I was okay. I was content in my heart. Even before Epaphroditus arrived with the money, I was okay. He says it like this in verse 11. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. And Paul, he's experienced both. He's experienced the posh, penthouse-esque apartment, and he's been beaten up and dumped in a prison cell. And if we're not really clear what he's saying, he says it again in verse 12. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. And if we don't get it, he unpacks it a little bit more. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And what Paul is saying is, I know what it's like to enjoy incredibly flavoursome dal, got to get dal in, and the most moist sourdough. But I also know what it's like to go days without eating. I know what it is to be in need. I also know what it's like to have plenty. And neither of these things ruin my contentment or my peace or my joy. He says, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. It's quite radical words, really, isn't it? Especially in the culture and society we live in. And especially when we remember that written by an inmate awaiting trial. An inmate who doesn't want to be where he is. A prisoner who's stuck. Someone who's in lockdown. And if we ever feel stuck like that, maybe in a dead-end job or in depression or in that relationship, stuck in debt, if we're stuck, what about Paul's words? I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. And yet, we think we arrive at contentment because we get everything we want. We think we arrive at contentment when all our circumstances are sorted. I heard the story of a wealthy employer who once heard one of his employees say, if I had £1,000, I know I'd be content. And the employer said, really? So he walked over and he said, I've never found contentment from my money, so I'm going to reach into my pocket and give you £1,000. Here you go. And he walked away, and as he walked away, he overheard the person say, I should have asked for 2,000. And that's human nature, isn't it? We never have enough. Experts have proven that getting more stuff does not bring happiness or contentment. One psychologist who'd done a lot of study on what brings contentment concluded, and the words will come up on the screen. If people shoot for a certain level of affluence, thinking that will make them happy, they find that on reaching it, they become very quickly habituated. And at that point, they start hankering for the next level of income, property, or good health. And our desires for stuff just go on and on and on. The Bible actually says in Proverbs, it says, hell and destruction is never full, and so is the heart of man never satisfied. But what's radical is that here, the Apostle Paul has found satisfaction. He's found contentment. And he's sharing this secret with us. To help me kind of unpack it, I want to introduce you to it. It. What is it? Well, it is that thing we think we need in order to be whole. We're kind of daydreaming into the horizon, thinking, okay, when I have it, then I'll be okay. When I have it, well, that's when my fragile self-esteem will be rescued. When I have it, then life will begin. Once I get it, when I have it. So what is your it? Once I finish school, once I graduate, once I get out of debt, once the DIY that was only meant to take 6 weeks is now taking 6 years, is finally done. Once I get that hot tub for the garden, once I get the Bianchi bike with the carbon forks, once I get the raise, once I get kids, when the kids leave home, when I get a bonus, when I get a different job, when the relationship is healed, once the financial crisis is over, when it happens, then I will experience peace and joy and contentment. So the big question is, what is your it? What is your it? And what happens is that we wait for it. And as we wait for it, we're postponing joy and peace. But we don't have to live like that. Look at verse 11. It says, I have learned to be content. I have learned to be content. And I find this really helpful, because this contentment did not come to Paul automatically. He says, I have learned. And he says it again in verse 12. I have learned the secret of being content. You see, it's not like some people get the contentment gene and others don't get the contentment gene. It's a learned response, not a natural response. What comes naturally to me is selfishness and me wanting more and more and more. Just think about children. Just think about a child and they're playing with a couple of toys as happy as they can be. And then they're content, but then another child walks in with a different toy. And suddenly that first child spies the other toy and wants the other toy, because they're no longer happy, are they? And I'm sure glad that we as adults aren't like that we outgrow that sort of behavior, isn't it? Or maybe you've heard the saying that the only difference between men and boys is the price of their toys. That we've not really learned to be content. You know, when I was preparing for the talk, I asked Claire, my wife, if she thought I was content. And I was having a kind of Hamlet cigar moment, sitting back rather smug, thinking, yep, I'm pretty content. I think I'm pretty good. However, Claire, without pausing for thought, said no. And then she promptly listed a number of areas I could work on. Thank you very much. But I've actually had a wee think about it since her cruel and unkind comments about me being discontent. And I'm on record, I'm not saying that Claire was right or anything, but there are certainly areas I am content with. But of course, I actually keep on hanging out with it. I'm hanging out with it all the time. My eyes are always spying it. And it made me think that, I can learn contentment in one area of life. I could graduate from that school of contentment. But there are lots of other areas where I don't quite make it. Or maybe I've graduated from this area, but actually 5 years later on I have to re-enroll because I'm now failing that class again. I think it works maybe a bit like this. There are times when we learn contentment during a season of financial shortage. Maybe we're skint, we're broke, we're students. And in that season of life, we simply can't afford to buy stuff that our friends are purchasing. We simply can't go on holidays that our friends are going on. But we can learn how to be content in that time of life. We find a way to cultivate a satisfied heart, peace and joy. And we graduate from the school of contentment in that season of our life. But then maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years later, we find ourselves earning a salary that dwarfs what we were making before. And so now contentment isn't a challenge, is it? Wrong. Because we find ourselves increasingly buying things we don't need, things we don't use. I mean, how many of you have Amazon parcels arriving and you don't even remember what you've bought? And it's time for us to re-enroll in the school of contentment. And many of us learn how to be content when we don't have much. But we've yet to learn how to do it when we have lots. And so we have to re-enroll again and again. There's maybe a couple and they need to enroll in a school of contentment when they're waiting for a child. Lord, as we're waiting, please give us joy, give us peace now. Help us not make the child the it. And then the child comes and they're content. And then number 2 comes and number 3 comes and There's these minions running around and they're having to learn contentment in a different way. And we talked about Paul being under house arrest, and there are parents who know exactly what that means. Or even just in this time of lockdown. We come out of lockdown, you put your kids back in school, then your child is deemed a close contact, and they're back at home, parole denied, 14 days in lockdown. And just as they're released, child number 2 is put into isolation. And so it goes on, permanent house arrest. And that sense of contentment that we had is ebbing and flowing, and we continually need to re-enroll. And then there will come a day when the children abandon us, they leave us. Because they do have a tendency to move out. Somewhere between the age of 18 and 47, they move out. And there's this empty nest thing that can go on, and our lives, they're so kid-focused for so long, but now they're gone, and instead of feeling this great relief, we're somehow not content. So again, we need to re-enroll. And for some of us, maybe it's just around the corner. There's going to be a season of illness or a season of medical tests. And we need to enroll in a school of contentment as we go through that. So that despite the awful and ugly space that we're in physically, we're in this beautiful place with God. For we are still content. We still somehow know His peace and know His joy. And surely it's a miracle from God to be able to be nauseous, to be ill, to be crippled, and to be able to say, God has given me peace now. He's giving me joy now. I'm experiencing His presence now, and that makes me content. For I've learned to be content. What a powerful, life-giving force that is, because what it means is that we can go through a season that's nasty without us becoming nasty. We can go through a season that's ugly, and we don't have to become ugly. And Paul had learned to be content. And he's saying, thank you so much for this gift. I'm so thankful that you brought this money, but you need to know I was really okay. I'm not thankful, I was okay. I was content. Now you might be sitting there going, Pete, yeah, but that's the Apostle Paul. I mean, it's Paul. I've never had the strength to be like that. And, well, it may shock you, neither did he. That's what I like. Philippians 4:13, I can do all this contentment stuff, I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. Maybe, I don't know if we're allowed, but John's asleep at the back. Maybe we should say it all aloud together. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. That was pretty pathetic. We'll do it one more time. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. Isn't that amazing? He's not talking about I can fly, I can do. He's talking about all this contentment stuff. And what we need to understand is that the Apostle Paul, the spiritual giant, Paul is saying, I couldn't do it myself either. I had to have help from the outside. The only way I could do it was through the strength that God gave me. Another translation puts it this way, for I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. Through Christ. Not through my own efforts, not through my own will, but through Christ. Let's try it without the word Christ in there, and I'll put another word in and see how that fits with us. I can do all things through alcohol that strengthens me. You know, some of us, we believe that, don't we? We think if I just have a good stiff drink here, it will be fine. But of course, it isn't fine. In fact, I think alcohol makes it worse. I can do all things through education that will strengthen me. You know, if I have a good education, I have a degree, then I can face anything. No, not really. That doesn't do it either. I mean, as wonderful as a good education is, it won't help. How about this? I can do all things through money that strengthens me. Well, we can do some things with money, but it can't do all things. I can do all things through friends who strengthen me. Friends abandon us and let us down. But Christ, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That just fits perfectly. And the secret to Paul's contentment came down to who he knew, not what he had. And the secret of contentment is found not in what we have, but in who we know. Hebrews 13:5, and I love this verse. Be content with what you have, because God has said, I will never leave you, never will I forsake you. And I think if the Apostle Paul was here, I think he would whisper down through the corridors of time just to you. He would say, you can be content because I'm with you. I'm with you through that family transition. I'm with you through that job crisis. I'm with you through that illness. I'm with you in this time of anxiety. I'm with you. For personally, we don't have the strength to pull it off. And neither did Paul. I can only do this through him who gives me strength. Words written by an inmate awaiting trial. And when we have Christ in our life, when we're having this close friendship and relationship with him, praying and reading his word, becoming more like him day after day, we'll find that contentment is because he is with us. This is what David meant when he wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And only the person who can say, "The Lord is my shepherd," can say, "I shall not want." If you're saying to me you're always wanting, maybe the Lord isn't your shepherd. Maybe if you're always thinking it has to be the next big thing, the next it, then the question is the Lord your shepherd? Have you come to know him in that way? I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. You know, it's not about passing through joyful circumstances. It's about the deep miracle of God in our hearts that bursts forth in praise because our focus is on the goodness, generosity, and presence of God. And these words written by Paul 2,000 years ago, they echo through time. And by the power of his Spirit, we are able to experience a full joy, deep peace, even when we're traveling through circumstances that we simply don't want to be in. For it is through Christ who strengthens me that we can do all things.